Oh wait, it's the start of the new video. Well, before I shoot you again, let's continue our dive, even deeper. We've traversed through the fog, and we're still not even close to the end, if there even is one. Regardless, oh, hold on. An exceptionally interesting story lies ahead. A story with a murky genesis, to say the very least, involving a man, to many, a dangerous genius, to others, a figure shrouded in sinister mystery, and to others more, merely a well-read and pitiful old man. Ranging from things involving extreme political organizations designed as a final contingency to Soviet influence, and a strange occult group with a myriad of lore behind it, to a rather goofy notoriety campaign on a David Icke forum, Yahoo chat group drama, and 4D space chess. Come, join me as we continue down this rabbit hole, this time exploring the story of David Myatt and his alleged occult creation, the Order of 9 Angles. Before we get into the meat and potatoes, I just wanted to make a few corrections. The first is in Almeida's detention memo, specifically with the patches here in the document. These are not Temple of Blood patches, they are Satanic Front patches, one of the groups that Joshua Sutter is believed to be a part of today. BX on X had pointed that out to me. By the way, go check her stuff out both on X and her writings on Substack. I can't recommend her stuff enough. She's a great investigative journalist. Next is my Five Eyes comment. Although I do believe the IC communities are involved, Sutter being a prime example, they aren't to the degree I initially believed. Kian Tvedan's comment on the matter was correct. I was making an assumption there. Doing further research into the topic has completely changed my opinion. I believe that the Order itself is responsible for most of the fog that surrounds it, mostly for the purposes to confuse outsiders and to further its labyrinthos mythologicus. Thank you for pointing that out, Kian, and thank you for the kind words. It means more than you know. If you're watching this, I hope you're doing well, and I hope you're able to find some peace. Thank you for all the work you've done. Alright, just want to get that out there. Let's get into it. There's a lot of speculation regarding the Order's origins and its founder. Many attribute its founding to, of course, David Myatt. As whether he's involved or not, both Myatt and the Order are so entangled with each other, it's impossible to separate the two. Of course, he denies this, claiming it to be merely a product of circumstantial evidence. A rebuttal, at face value, can work in an instance or two. But what about 3, 4, or 5 more? How many coincidences and odd circumstances can there be before it becomes a pattern? He created the Star Game while incarcerated in 1975. The Order incorporating his numinous way / pathy-mathos philosophy. Myatt writing Vindex, Destiny of the West during his neo-Nazi days, along with a 31-page book titled The Mythos of Vindex. Vindex itself just so happens to be a major acausal entity in their mythos, meant specifically for the West. Quote, Vindex will then be the creator of the Western Empire. Even if he isn't involved, the O9A would be fundamentally different without his influence. That being said, the official founding of this strange occult group is attributed to a man by the name of Anton Long, of which many believe this to be an alias of not only Myatt himself, but seemingly used by many others within the Order seeking to further its mythos. Not only is this speculation and theorizing confusing, it is done so intentionally. As stated by the TWS Nexion on the Internet Archive in David Myatt and Gladio, where he or she is responding to a conspiracy regarding Myatt's involvement with the Gladio network during his time in Column 88. Quote, this is all good conspiracy theory stuff, aiding both the O9A and the Myatt myth, as do other stories about the occult phantom menace known as the O9A. But don't just take it from an acclaimed Nexion. Take it from Anton Long himself, cited by himself in a 2021 interview conducted by Rachel Sterling. Quote, to engender confusion, to provoke a reaction, to sow doubts, to cause dissent, to have mundanes repeat Magian mantras, to cause and to reveal differences among our own sinister kindred are all part of the O9A's labyrinthos mythologicus. Although I think there is extremely compelling evidence to suggest that David Myatt is Anton Long, or, at the very least, is the original iteration of him, I aim to piece together as clear a picture as I can of both men. Luckily, unlike his alleged former compatriot, Joshua Caleb Sutter, Myatt has a plethora of writings, autobiographical and otherwise, available for public viewing, scattered across many different internet archives, ranging from the man himself and his detractors to rather suspicious surnames, aliases, and proclaimed O9A adherents. David Myatt has lived an exceptionally interesting and storied life, by far the most interesting out of anyone mentioned in this series. From a neo-Nazi abdicating for a spacefaring galactic imperium in his time in Column 88, to a humble Christian monk, and later to a radical Muslim jihadist, which, interestingly enough, his writing, The Significance of the Taliban for the Muslim Ummah, was found in Osama bin Laden's possession by the CIA. Myatt's genesis comes from a place I certainly didn't expect. Born in 1950 in colonial East Africa, a childhood filled with whimsy and adventure, along with fond memories of family travel, from sanctioned car rides to long walks with his younger sister down previously forbidden roads. This whimsy and fondness for the outdoors would continue to follow him throughout his life, not being one for spotless class attendance at his Catholic prep school, rather opting to explore the courtyard, climb trees, daydream, and inspect whatever caught his interest with a magnifying glass. This short stint in school would be just that, and through his eventual expulsion, he'd be outdoors full-time for some time more. It wouldn't be until later on as the 50s faded into history, and with Myatt's travel into the Far East, specifically Singapore, where he began to develop a heavy appetite for school and knowledge. At first, decrying sitting stationary at a desk, doing schoolwork and activities in an air-conditioned building, rather opting for the better open air in the courtyards. However, he would come to enjoy it. Quote, "Then, and quite why I do not recall, I began to enjoy it. Perhaps it was the running track, where I loved to run barefoot in the tropical heat. Perhaps it was the young, gorgeous blonde English teacher who would often sit on one of the desks at the front, her legs crossed, and read to us some story, some poem, or some part of a classic novel. Whatever it was, I began to look forward to that school. Not only did he look forward to it, he excelled in it, being the top 2 in many of his classes. This hunger for knowledge would only grow within him, reading whatever he could get his hands on, especially when it came to physics, astronomy, and history, even becoming proficient in ancient Greek, a skill he has used widely throughout his life and still uses to this day." Saying this absorption of knowledge had shaken him awake. Quote, "It was as if I had suddenly, quite unexpectedly, acquired a new way of seeing the world around me, as if some unforeseen force, some weird, some daimon had shaken me and awoken within me certain dormant faculties. Or perhaps it was just the lovely tropical weather, the quixotic surroundings. It didn't just stop with the opening of his mind's eye, but the setting of a fire in his heart. This insight, the knowledge he embedded within himself, showed him just how much potential we as humans intrinsically have. As he grew in both body and mind, this insight of his became a vision of something greater, a species meant to explore and conquer the cosmos. This insight became a vision of, as I have written elsewhere, us freeing ourselves from the chains of this world and venturing forth to explore and colonize the stars. For I felt that it was this new freedom, brought by venturing forth to the stars, which would give us the great challenges needed to evolve still further, and naturally, into another type of being. And it was this pursuit of this ideal which I believed would create noble individuals and a noble civilized society. Myatt would continue to grow his interests during his time in Singapore, becoming proficient in chess and playing it at every opportunity he could, and even competitively. It was during this time where he had fallen into some old habits and wandered off during a chess grandmaster's lecture. It was in this exploration where he had happened across a group of Chinese men during their martial arts training. Myatt becoming immediately enamored with their display of strength and grace. Quote, "It was almost ballet-ic, full of seemingly effortless grace, and I felt at once that I wanted to be able to do that, to move so gracefully with the ability to generate, direct, and control a certain physical power." The men, at first reluctant to let the young Myatt join their training. However, his persistence persuaded them. Through his time with these fighters and the subsequent meetings of his martial arts master, he would develop another interest, this time with the study of East Asian philosophies, Singapore being a major hub for such interests, as they had a large variety of Buddhist, Hindu, and Taoist temples, and gatherings with a rich well of knowledge to boot, as well as a, quote, good place also to be initiated as a boy into the delights of women, or more correctly, learning of and from the delights of young, delightful foreign ladies. After his stay in Singapore, Myatt and his family would move to where a great deal of the significant events in his life would take place, Great Britain. At first arrival, he would only develop a bad case of homesickness for both the Far East and his home country in East Africa, the bleak, cloudy, cold English days only exacerbating this pit of longing. His father sharing the young Myatt's sentiment, seeking and finding alternative employment back in Africa, Myatt, along with his father and mother, being elated at the thought of going back to their home. His father did end up returning. However, Myatt and his mother were unable to join him immediately, rather having to wait 6 months beforehand in order for his father to find his wife and son meaningful accommodations. During this period, Myatt would find himself in a great depression, the fire he found burning so brightly now dwindling with each dreary day. Quote, the desire I had nurtured for some time to study studiously and to go to English university to read physics slowly dwindled, the dull, cold bleakness of the English weather as water thrown upon that fire. During this waiting period, he would end up venturing off on his own, slugging through college and pedaling through the English countryside. But just like his childhood travels in Africa, he would gain a fondness and appreciation for England's fenland countryside. During the same time period, Myatt would be afforded an allowance by his father, giving him the opportunity to travel further into and around England, along with continuing his literary interests. One of these destinations was London, exploring the city's bookshops and museums, but also venturing into the less salubrious parts of London. Bolstered by his martial arts training, and in search of a, quote, suitable young lady to entertain me, he did end up finding such a lady, of which he would develop a relationship with. It was on one of these nights in the iconic city, where seemingly a rhyme of Myatt's past was taking place. He happened upon a group of young men fighting in the street. However, unlike the martial artists in Singapore, this was no training session. Seeing one being beaten by many, he jumped into the fray in order to even the odds. Quote, without thinking, I waded in to help. There was that exhilaration again, that love of direct physical violence I had felt before. A few more young lads joined the melee, and then it was over. And so we went, quite naturally, to some nearby public house to celebrate our victory. Myatt and his newfound compatriots would end up drinking and talking politics, Myatt revealing just what kind of politics he had been enamored with studying months prior to this brawl, being specifically with National Socialism, and particularly inspired by the actions of Otto Ernst Reamer, a former major in the Wehrmacht army during the Second World War. Myatt would give more detail in his writing, The Ethos of Extremism. Quote, my initial motivation for joining these organizations and becoming politically active was simple: to further the cause of National Socialism and to enjoy the comradeship, the struggle for power, and the violence. Sometime before becoming so involved, I had chanced upon a copy of Schreiber's book, The Rise and Fall of the Third Reich, and was inspired by the described actions of Otto Ernst Reamer during the July 1944 plot against Hitler. Familiar as I was with the Iliad of the Odyssey, with Hellenistic culture and history in general, I youthfully, rashly, made a connection between the heroes of ancient Greece and Reamer, impressed as I was by Reamer's loyalty and sense of duty. Reamer himself playing a significant role in stopping Operation Valkyrie, the failed assassination attempt on Adolf Hitler. Myatt would later come to meet Reamer during his decade-long travels through Egypt and the Muslim world, believing he was the embodiment of the warrior archetype, and just the man to be at the forefront of the ideal society that he had been so enthralled with, the society that would be the precursor to humanity's conquering of the stars. Quote, Reamer seemed the perfect embodiment of the warrior, of the type of person who might build a new society I had often theorized about, precursor as that society would be for our exploration and colonization of the stars. It would be through his newfound and like-minded compatriots that would reignite the fire that had dwindled within him when he had first arrived in England. He had found young men whom, just like himself, not only reveled in physical combat, but with enough time and training could help bring his precursor society to life. After a meeting and subsequent after-party, he would meet someone that knew John Colin Campbell Jordan, the founder of Britain's National Socialist movement. Myatt, already knowing of the man, wasting no time establishing contact. According to Nicholas Goodrick Clark's book, Black Sun, a book Myatt himself and others have criticized, Jordan was an outlier in the post-war fascist movement. As the leader of the British Union, formerly known as the British Union of Fascists, Oswald Mosley desired to distance himself and those within his party from their wartime legacy, seeking to avoid what Nazi Germany had fostered. Jordan wanted no such thing, and reveled in this legacy. Quote, "Such caution was cast aside for the first time ever since the war in spring of 1962 by Colin Jordan, a British neo-Nazi leader who admired Hitler and revived all the Nazi props of brown shirts, breeches and jackboots, swastika armbands, together with the slogans of Sieg Heil, Juden Raus, and the Horst Wessel song. These events would be what reignited the fire within his heart, and the catalyst for him choosing to remain in England instead of returning to Africa. Quote, "For nearly a year I came to inhabit 3 quite separate worlds. My lady friend in London, the world of occasionally violent but always interesting political activism, and my academic studies. Thus I was fully occupied, enthused, alive, replete with my various ways of living, so that when the date for my return to Africa drew ever nearer, there really was no need to make a decision, for my lives seemed then inextricably linked with England." Although Myatt would choose to stay in Britain, his study in university would wane significantly, as the academic slog would erode his interest in his chosen field of study, physics. The final straw being the carelessness by a lecturer in destroying the replication of his attempt at the Michelson-Morley experiment, as he was interested in the aether. With this, Myatt's interest in the subject completely disappeared, and his political activism only intensified in its place, continuing to attend political rallies and meeting more allies, and even eventually serving as Colin Jordan's bodyguard. It would be at one of these political frays that he would meet and immediately connect with Eddie Morrison, another British National Socialist activist. Quote, "One such political foray, I met Eddie Morrison and his friends. I immediately liked Morrison. He was enthusiastic, committed, optimistic, down to earth, and quite au fait with National Socialism. Through his connection with Morrison and his friends, Myatt would make the decision to forego college altogether, opting to become a full-time street activist, moving with Morrison to Leeds, a town in West Yorkshire, England, where he would only hone his skills in the art of the revolutionary political agitator. Myatt's beginning conception of National Socialism, in his words, were born out of political naivete. As said not long before, he admired the actions of Otto Ernst Riemer and likened him to the Greek heroes of old, along with Nazi Germany as a whole, believing, since he was a teenager, that it had embodied the noble and warrior-like ideal he had come to admire. His correspondences with Colin Jordan aided this worldview, recommending the works of, and even introducing him to Savitri Devi, a prominent figure within the neo-Nazi underground and a former spy for the Axis powers in India. She aimed to synthesize Hinduism and Nazism, being a proponent for esoteric Nazism, claiming that Hitler was an avatar of Vishnu. Through her, he would meet the aforementioned Otto Ernst Riemer, and receive one of his most treasured possessions from the man, a signed autograph. Myatt's initial aim with National Socialism was to further humanity into a galactic empire, to breed a new warrior explorer species. Even before his discovery of Nazism, this was his aim, at first not having any sort of racial component or doctrine during his first years as a Nazi. Quote, "Before this, I had no opinions, no views about such matters, and my understanding of National Socialism was greatly aided and developed by personal discussions and by written correspondences I had with Colin Jordan. However, that would change as he became more acquainted with those around him. Quote, I soon developed the same prejudices and the same hatreds as the people I came to associate with. Prejudices and hatreds aided by pamphlets and books read, loaned, and given, and by discussions with party members, especially those belonging to the British movement. Although these prejudices would become a major component within Myatt's worldview, his greatest goal would remain the same: humanity's eventual evolution into a galactic empire. It was through this ideal that fueled his violent awakening in Leeds, coming to the conclusion that in order for the empire to come to fruition, it would be necessary to overthrow society as it stands, via electoral means, or utilizing a violent revolutionary alternative at any cost. Quote, I set about doing just that, ready, willing, and prepared to use violence in order to aid and achieve political goals. For I then considered that sacrifices were necessary in order for these goals to be achieved, and that once achieved, the violent struggle would have been worthwhile, even if it cost me my own life, or that of others. Thus, I placed some idealized version of the future before my own personal happiness. Indeed, my own happiness became the struggle for, and the practical realization of, that vision of the future. Although Myatt held these views, he directed his ire towards his ideological enemies rather than those he perceived as an inferior race, saying it was not in his nature to be personally rude, offensive, or violent towards individuals unless he was put into a self-defense situation. For 6 years as a street activist, he would intentionally seek out the rallies that had potential to turn violent and reveling in them. Other colleagues of his saying he had a death wish. That being said, Myatt did indeed promote racial hatred via public speeches, discussion with his peers, and his writings along with other media, viewing this prejudice as more impersonal propaganda. Quote, I did for a long time, directly and indirectly, incite hatred and violence against other races, both by speeches, often vitriolic, impassioned, and always extempore. I gave at political events, in discussions with comrades and others, by means of articles I wrote, and by posters, leaflets, stickers that I designed. But this was, to me, at the time, impersonal, just propaganda, somewhat calculated and regarded as necessary in order to achieve certain political goals. This violent struggle, coupled with his newfound prejudicial worldview, would lead Myatt into his first prison sentence during his time in West Yorkshire. He, Eddie Morrison, and a few others had been handing out anti-immigration leaflets in Wakefield, another town in West Yorkshire, in hopes of gaining some new recruits to their cause. However, new recruitment was much more of an afterthought. Rather, he was hoping for a fight. His wish would soon be granted. He and Morrison would come across some other skinheads, of which he was somewhat familiar with. Morrison choosing to leave, while Myatt decided to stay and join the group. The men would wander the town until coming across and harassing some young Pakistani men, throwing stones and verbally/racially berating them, the men running away while Myatt and company gave chase. The men, bolstered by their success, sought new targets, but would instead find a number of police in their wake, eventually arresting Myatt and the other men he had accompanied. It would be during this first prison sentence where Myatt would develop the Star Game, the game being heavily inspired by the readings of Carl Jung's work in Arnold J. Toynbee's A Study of History, a 12-volume series of universal history, showcasing the common evolutionary process between nearly 30 civilizations, the majority being major civilizations and around 7 to 9 of them being arrested civilizations. This process being genesis, growth, time of troubles, universal state, and disintegration, a process in which they all had come to pass. Myatt's aim was to give physical representation to his theory of clinology, inspired by Jung's The Mystery of Connection and his Psychology and Alchemy. Clinology, or clindodynamics, is essentially a means of studying history through mathematics and using the data acquired to create predictive models to macro-historical events. Myatt's goal with the Star Game was to, quote, find a common and abstract means, possibly mathematical or employing symbolic logic, to represent the transformations, the processes which I felt were common to or which underlaid A. the various personality types described by Jung, B. the Jungian process of individuation, C. the development and the stages of civilization as described by Toynbee, the organic nature of civilizations, D. the bifurcation of the causal/acausal, and E. what I at the time called the flux of acausal and causal via causal time. We'll go into more detail on that later. Myatt's stint in prison would only embolden him in his ideals, and further sharpen his extremism into a finer point, further exemplifying his National Socialist ideals of Kampf or struggle, and the Führerprinzip or the leadership principle, likening prison life to that of a masculine tribal society where might, force, and one's own cunning triumph and are necessary to one's survival and prosperity. Myatt, being no stranger to violence, reveled in this opportunity. Instead of being scared straight, as his judge had hoped, it made him more violent and more fanatical in his already firmly cemented ideals, learning new skills and establishing dangerous contacts. one of these skills being in running and managing a prison racket, smuggling and selling illicit paraphernalia and stolen goods within the compound. Upon his release, Myatt would leave with more money than he had entered with, but only utilize these skill sets further, without the confines of prison walls, creating a small gang of petty criminals for the initial purpose to aid his political endeavors. Quote, suffice to say, this gang, more petty criminals than racketeers, was based in and around Leeds, and consisted of some useful people. For example, someone who worked in a large department store, and someone employed by the British Railways, who had access to large parcels and rail freight. Thus, these types of people had easy access to useful, saleable goods. The railway employees would simply change the labels and documentation, so that the goods were misdelivered to a contact, and then sold onto a fence, while the store employees would arrange delivery of goods in a similar way, or one of our people would simply collect them in-store and boldly walk out with them. For some reason, I cannot quite now recall, Eddie Morrison became involved on the periphery of this group. Perhaps he may have wanted a certain item or two, which I, being his friend, said I could supply, etc. Myatt's operations would be going smoothly until a member of his gang had informed on him, along with Eddie Morrison and some others. The reason being was a grudge of a scorned lover. Quote, the simple truth is that he had a violent argument with his girlfriend. She came to see me and stayed around for 2 weeks. Both Myatt and Morrison would be sent to prison, the former not coping too well to his newfound predicament, the latter settling in quite comfortably. Quote, having previously spent some time in Armley jail, being on remand there did not bother me at all, and soon I settled back into prison life. Morrison, however, did not cope very well, and seemed genuinely surprised that I was rather enjoying myself. But, as I said somewhat humorously to one of the arresting police officers during one of my interrogations, you get 3 meals a day, free accommodations, and there's lots of friends around, so what's the big deal? The case against him would ultimately be dropped, due to the lack of evidence. Rather, he would only be convicted with the receiving and handling of stolen goods. Myatt would continue in his thuggish street activism during this time, but one day, he would be invited to a meeting with Colin Jordan and those within the British Council's inner circle. At this meeting, the members decided to offer him a position at the table, but Myatt would decline this position in favor of creating his own much more violent organization. Essentially, his racketeering gang, but labeled as a political party, convincing both Morrison and another ally of theirs by the name of Joe Short, whom, just like Myatt, had allegations of satanic allegiances. The party would be dubbed the National Democratic Freedom Movement, and would only be in operational existence for little under a year. The intent of the organization was to build a violent revolutionary street movement, conducting speeches, holding demonstrations, and attempting to recruit others and promote National Socialism under the guise of nationalism. This party soon being noted as just that by both Myatt's peers, such as John Tyndall, founder of Spearhead magazine, saying, the National Democratic Freedom Movement concentrated its activities mainly upon acts of violence against its opponents. Before very long, the NDFM had degenerated into nothing more than a criminal gang, but also by his adversaries, such as those in Searchlight magazine, in their article regarding Joe Short. Quote, he was soon back in business with Leeds Nazi Eddie Morrison, together with Satanist cat strangler, that's a new one, Dave Myatt. They set up the National Democratic Freedom Movement. It soon became noted for its violence. Myatt even giving some highlights of this time in the NDFM, most of which were street fights or trying to provoke them, stealing and destroying signs, inciting crowds, one of which they were grossly outnumbered, and lastly, another mass brawl at the Leeds Town Hall, ending in their and many others' arrests. Not long after, those within Myatt and Morrison's party becoming disillusioned with their efforts. Myatt would be found guilty of inciting the crowds and slapped with several fines. Myatt's disillusionment only worsening as his peers, including Morrison, received witness compensation at his trial, enough to pay off his fines, but none stepped forward. Myatt remarking, what rather disgusted me after this trial was the several so-called comrades, including, if my memory is correct, Morrison, having appeared as witnesses at the trial, collected between them witness expenses sufficient to pay my fines, but not one of them offered to do this, and I was not going to ask. He wouldn't end up paying these fines, instead opting to leave Leeds altogether. The NDFM would fail in its endeavors and fall into obscurity. Simply a footnote in a larger history. Although this party would fail, Myatt states that it served as an exceptionally valuable learning experience. The police would eventually catch up with him, and he would yet again serve another stint in prison, wasting no time getting back into the racketeering business, this time under the cover as a prison librarian. Although Myatt's own organization would die not long after its inception, he had become part of another much more organized and much more infamous group of National Socialists prior, a group now known to be the British branch of NATO's Gladio networks, Column 88. I don't want to go too off topic, as Gladio is a gaping abyss in itself. The whole damn book has been written on it. But I do want to give you a solid understanding. Broken in the early 1990s by former Italian Prime Minister Giulio Andreotti, Operation Gladio, used to describe the Italian branch, but now has become more of a catch-all term, was described as a stay-behind operation conducted in Western Europe as a means to defend against any potential Soviet invasion, planned, conducted, and deployed by the CIA, along with aid from the Vatican and the Italian Mafia, not long after their founding in 1947. By the late 1950s, clandestine Gladio forces, along with secret caches of weapons and supplies, were hidden all throughout the European continent, including the famously neutral lands of Sweden and Switzerland. Andreotti deciding to break this news to the Italian Senate because he thought there was simply no more need for the stay-behind forces, given the changing political climate, saying the nightmare of the wars and the divisions had come to an end. However, Andreotti wasn't always so forthcoming, as years prior in 1974, during his time as Minister of Defense, he would deny any such claims of a hidden clandestine army. It would only be uncovered through the investigations of the Ordine Nuovo terrorist organization after they had carried out a number of attacks, and resulting in many deaths, along with the discovery of the murdered Aldo Moro's fears of a conspiracy to destabilize his nation by a shadow organization and other secret services of the West. Moro being murdered by the Red Bridges, an extreme left-wing terrorist organization, before he could begin Italy's historic compromise, which essentially entailed a union between his center-left Christian Democracy Party and the Italian Communist Party. The Bridges were believed to be heavily infiltrated by the CIA and Italy's Secret Service. Testimony by former Italian generals would showcase the fears of a communist rise and give more credence to Moro's fears. Quote, "In the 1970s, with communist electoral support growing and other leftists looking menacing, the establishment turned to the strategy of tension, with Gladio eager to be involved, creating a need not only for a response to physical invasion, but to counter an internal subversion by a preemptive strike." General Gerardo Serravalle, one of the former heads of Italy's Gladio network, testified that the upper echelons had the idea of attacking the communists before an invasion, later stating, "They were saying this: why wait for the invaders when they can make a preemptive attack now on the communists who would support the invader?" Further efforts made by Felice Casson and Carlo Mastelloni, both former Italian magistrates whom had been the first to discover the operation's existence, would further uncover the veil of secrecy, primarily during their investigations into the Petiano massacre and the Argo 16 plane crash, the former being perpetrated by Vincenzo Vinciguerra, Carlo Cicottini, and Ivano Boccaccio, all men a part of the Ordine Nuovo. The attack itself involved a Fiat 500 rigged into a car bomb. An anonymous tip of the vehicle had been given to law enforcement, and when they had gone to inspect the vehicle further, it detonated, killing 3 of the officers and leaving 2 injured. He discovered that the explosives themselves were from one of the Gladio supply caches stationed throughout Italy. Although many of these supply depots were stated to be dismantled, 12 were unable to be found. The latter being an aircraft dubbed Argo 16, deployed on intel gathering operations against the Yugoslavian radar network over the Adriatic Sea, later found to be used for men and supply transports within the Italian Gladio network. Although it's seemingly true that the craft was indeed used for supply and unit transports, speculation rose of why the plane had crashed. It was hypothesized that those within Gladio had a problem with the dismantling of certain weapon depots and had sabotaged the plane, causing its crash, and the many subsequent deaths. Head of Italy's Gladio network, the now deceased Paolo Incerilli, stated, "The hypothesis that Argo 16 was sabotaged for internal issues in Gladio is enormous nonsense. There was no reason why such a thing could happen." Mastelloni would continue on his investigations, being met with much resistance. However, he would soon come to accuse Israeli intelligence head Zvi Zamir and Asa Levin, head of Mossad in Italy, of Argo 16's crash, the Gladio connection being much more of a footnote in this specific story. The reason for the sabotage stated by Giannadelio Maletti, former head of Italy's Secret Service, SID, in an interview with Daniela Mastrogiacomo, said that Ace 11 had approached him in regards to the capture of members of Black September, a Palestinian terrorist organization caught trying to destroy an Israeli airliner using smuggled ground-to-air missiles in Ostia, Italy. They had been arrested and were going to be deported to Libya. However, Ace 11 wanted them transported to Tel Aviv. Maletti didn't comply with this. 3 days before the crash, they had transferred the men back to Libya. On the men's return, they had made a stop on the small island country of Malta, where, according to Maletti, agents of Mossad had been encountered, Maletti calling it an unhappy stop. Not long after, the events of Argo 16 would take place. Andreotti, and further stating that the CIA had approached Italy in the early 1950s, wanting to deploy the stay-behind operation at the Yugoslav border, where Soviet threat was believed to be the most prominent. By the end of the decade, the operation would come under NATO's umbrella of influence. Once Andriani publicly exposed the story, other Gladio networks began to be uncovered, mostly by other European leadership. Quote, European officials have come forward in the last several days and described stockpiles of weapons and explosives hidden in Western European countries since the start of the Cold War. The arms were used by hundreds of resistance fighters trained to counter a Soviet invasion, the officials said. The former Prime Minister of Luxembourg, Jacques Santer, adding, NATO was the initiator and the coordinator, but each member nation was the master of its own operation. The US would deny any sort of control it had over the Italian operation, and further deny any claims that the CIA was involved in terrorist activities taking place in Italy at the time. Of course, this is all towards the end of Gladio's saga, and was largely only concerning the Italian branch of the operation. There is a lot more to know, to say the least. But now that we have a good understanding of what Gladio is, what it was set up to do, and how it came to light, let's turn back to Myatt and his time in Column 88. The group itself was found to be within the British division of the Strategy of Tension. Myatt saying he was unaware of their clandestine nature, but willing to fight for their cause should the Soviets invade, as he felt that they were genuine in their National Socialist ideals, seeking to infiltrate and spread them within British society. Quote, according to Jen received decades later, Column 88 was actually part of NATO's pan-European underground Gladio network, set up and trained to employ guerrilla tactics against the Soviets had they ever invaded, as was still expected in those days. But I knew nothing of this at the time, and simply enjoyed being part of and training with Column 88. For C-88 seemed to me to be a genuine National Socialist group, devoted to comradeship and to the slow process of socially and politically infiltrating British society, with perhaps some possibility that, if the need arose, such as a Soviet invasion, we might do our bit as National Socialists and fight them. Founded as far back as 1945 and operating covertly up until the 1970s, where the group became more openly active. Its military commander being Major Ian Soter Clarence, whom had served in Scotland's Black Watch Division during World War II, and its head and intelligence officer being a man by the name of Leslie Eric Lutz Vaughan, being a longtime member of the British Nationalist Party and its paramilitary wing, Spearhead. According to the Encyclopedia of British and Irish Political Organizations, activities attributed to this group were sending letter bombs, blowing up pylons, the firebombing of conservatives' homes, and infiltration of the Territorial Army, among with carrying out other terroristic plots and infiltrating many other far-right organizations. The group itself being highly organized and militaristic in nature, Myatt's account corroborating this, stating that they were much different from any other National Socialist group he had encountered thus far, this only being extenuated in his first encounter and attempting to join the group. Quote, for I had been instructed to wait in some obscure lay-by in Wiltshire, and was patiently doing so, when several speeding vehicles arrived and proceeded, in an impressive maneuver, to surround and block the car I had been waiting in, with several very obviously fit young men exiting quickly from these vehicles, further impressing him with the camaraderie and enthusiasm for National Socialism, as he had met more young like minds from all over Europe, later on at a meeting or get-together at Eric Lutz Van's home. Myatt believing he had felt the spirit of National Socialism come alive again, something in his time thus far within the movement had been slowly withering away. Although there was combat training, the highlights for Myatt was the aforementioned camaraderie and the Führerfests, where many would come from all over Europe to celebrate Hitler's birthday, taking solace in that so many remembered his sacred mission. Quote, it was inspiring to know, to feel that Adolf Hitler and his sacred mission had not been forgotten, that there were others, many others, in other lands who felt the same way and who understood, rationally or instinctively, or both, the essential goodness and nobility of National Socialism itself. He would also note that many of those in C-88 were not the archetypical street Nazi, rather educated, connected, and covert, professional and family-orientated, not a shaved head nor a pair of Beauvoir boots to be seen. Rather, he believed himself to be much more comparable to the latter, as his history of prison stints and street fighting contrasted heavily with the members of C-88. However, he would still be invited among their ranks and even into their homes of their leadership. Quote, that I, a hardened street Nazi thug with a criminal record, had been accepted into the home of L's wife and family, and into the homes of other C-88 members, was pleasing because it seemed to me to express the nobility, the folk equality of National Socialism itself. Myatt's yearning for the camaraderie met within the now-defunct Column 88. Their paramilitary nature, coupled with their aristocratic professionalism, gave him hope that ground could be taken and progress finally made in line with the goals of modern National Socialism. Seeing that he and others that he had associated with previously were not alone, being true in their ideals and willing to carry out violent acts for them, Myatt's resolve would only strengthen, believing he and his peers were to continue on in the struggle that had been started only a couple decades prior to them, using covert tactics or overt terrorism in said struggle, even if it costed him, his comrades, his enemies, or the innocent their lives. Quote, a realization that both covert action and terrorism were or might be useful tactics to employ in the struggle for victory, a struggle which I, extremist and fanatic that I was, accepted would be brutal, violent, and bloody, and thus possibly cost the lives of us, some of our opponents, and even some non-combatants. The fall of Nazi Germany was seen as a mere setback in this struggle, and would later be avenged. Discussions of what had to be done in order to spread their NS ideals began with C-88, mainly through covert, subversive action, introducing NS policies through more palatable center-right leaning parties/movements as a cover. Myatt and co. coming up with two types of covert action, the first being a honeypot in order to attract the non-political to be useful for their cause, even if they had to be blackmailed to do so. Quote, to attract non-political people who might be or who had the potential to be useful to the cause, even if, or especially if, they had to be blackmailed or persuaded into doing so at some future time. The second would be a group dedicated to creating a core of sleeper cells, of fanatics ready and willing to be disruptive and subversive on command. However, both these ideas would execute fairly anticlimactically. According to Myatt, two things were to blame. The first is his own shortcoming of leadership skills, as he largely disliked the slog of daily organization and the petty manipulation that came with it. Those were the tools of a leader or organizer mindset. He gravitated towards the lead-up of and physical action. Quote, while I enjoyed and lived for political action, especially confrontation and brawls, and was motivated, fanatical enough to speak extempore in public and take charge in violent situations on the streets, and loved to plan such violence and motivate people to undertake it, I disliked the day-to-day organization and the, to me, petty manipulation that was, or seemed to me to be, the lot of an organizer and leader. I also lacked the charm, the charisma, the flexibility a political organizer and leader needed. To make up for this shortcoming, he had asked his friend and comrade, Eddie Morrison, to become its leader and organizer. By contrast, Morrison was, according to Myatt, far more likable and possessed the traits and experience he had lacked, whereas he was more feared/respected on part of being a violent psychopath. His words, not mine. Myatt saw him to be the perfect leader of both the covert groups within C-88 and his NDFM. Morrison would end up refusing Myatt's persuasions in both C-88 and his ideas of covert action, in part of his disinterest in paramilitary organization, and in part because of the pool of people Myatt had chosen from for these covert measures. The core fanatical group of extremists would merely fade out of existence, as those he was able to recruit as sleeper cells simply chose to aid the honeypot. As for the pool of people, they were largely from an unnamed secret occult group. This would be only one of the handful of times Myatt would admit to anything publicly under his own name that he had anything to do with the occult. Quote, second, the outer nature chosen for the group, which was of a secret occult group with the offer, the temptation, of sexual favors from female members in a ritualized occult setting, with some of these female members being on the game and associated with someone who was associated with my small gang of thieves. Morrison, beyond being a fan of H.P. Lovecraft, had no interest in real-world occultism, so Myatt had to search for another lead for this covert cabal, of which he had found in the form of an unnamed businessman who suggested the outer occult in the first place. Quote, thus, I had to make do with someone else as an organizer and leader of this covert group. This person, then a comrade, a married businessman living near Manchester, being the one who had suggested the outer, the occult, form of the group. For a time, the group seemed to flourish, collecting some respectable and useful people to the NS cause. However, the hedonism came to overtake the group, overshadowing the original political purpose Myatt had in mind for it, the tools of persuasion and subsequent blackmail being lost. Myatt still believing in the idea of a subversive honeypot for some time afterwards, this time with more direct overt action, using the troubles of the Cold War, threat of Soviet invasion, and the increasing IRA attacks throughout England as a cover for potential NS takeover, causing disruption and fear in order to bring about a more authoritative governmental policy such as martial law. Through this, they would gradually implement more NS-type policies. These ideas and moods, as Myatt states, were reflected in certain minorities in and around British society, becoming more aware of this sentiment through his contacts in C-88. Quote, this discontent did capture a certain mood among certain people during that period, a mood I had some personal knowledge of, partly as a result of C-88 contacts, partly as a result of some trips I made to Northern Ireland, and partly as a result of other contacts such as squaddies involved with or supportive of right-wing groups, coupled with the landscape of Britain being a very different place than what it is today. Industrial attacks and national front rallies of thousands being commonplace, along with public support of the Stop Immigration, Start Repatriation campaign, gave him a ground in reality and a chance for the change he sought. However, it wouldn't be much longer before his interest in such ideas of covert action and his involvement in National Socialism would once again dwindle and disappear along with his life in Leeds, following another arrest and stay in prison. Myatt would go on discussing his reflections, spelled with an X, of this time and his fanaticism, believing much of these ideas were born out of a necessity of struggle, sacrifice, and bloodshed in order to survive and thrive, likening his sentiment to that of the Roman Empire, saying they did not maintain their dominance by way of diplomacy and peace talk, but rather through conquest, through ruthless men hardened by war. Threats to the Roman way of life were met with severe punishment, quoting Hitler's Mein Kampf with regards to the masses being more responsive to the philosophy of strength and uncompromising leadership, carried out by men of heroic spirit, saying that hatred was not the root of his belief, but rather a naive struggle for war and the idealistic notions of glory and sacrifice. Race would only become a component of these ideas. Quote, hence, to me now, on reflection, it does not seem to be hatred of whatever type that motivated those ideas, such a terrorist plan of mine, but rather a glorification of war, of strife, a belief in struggle, in the survival of the fittest, a naive desire to personally act based upon idealistic notions of sacrifice and glory, of being part of a desperate struggle, a war that began with Hitler and the NSDAP. Discussion of these ideas with those in Column 88 would have little staying power, as C-88 was more concerned with Soviet invasion and its influence, or wanting to act as a counter to an internal rise of a communist takeover, and opted for the slow infiltration of National Socialism into British society. However, his enthusiasm and ideas didn't fall upon completely deaf ears. As Myatt states, perhaps it was these ideas of mine, my enthusiasm for and rants about such action to select C-88 people, of course, that later on resulted in a sort of bomb-making package being produced by some of them, one of which packages was delivered to me in Leeds on my release from prison in 1976. He would not go through any sort of plot himself, as his loss of idealism and change of heart compelled him down other more peaceful roads, this time as a Christian monk, at least for a little while. But as Myatt states, this would not last long, and his influence would eventually catch up with him. This era of peace would be brought on by yet another phase of disillusionment, Myatt believing that the requisite loyalty and honor he had expected from his peers had fallen short, not only to themselves, but failing to inspire the same virtues in others for the cause. Instead, in its place was infighting and malicious gossip. Quote, instead of idealism, loyalty, and honor, there were continual feuds, continued disloyalty, and little to no honor, manifest most often as this dishonor was in the spreading of malicious rumors behind people's backs. Myatt believing he no longer belonged, this feeling brewing within him, as during the time he was evading authorities and the fines that had been placed upon him, he found himself back into the British countryside yet again, back into the Fenland, studying the works of Jung and Toynbee, along with Buddhism. But the authorities would eventually find him and send him back to prison. Upon his return, as stated before, he simply found himself out of place, no longer belonging to this way of life. Instead, in his time on the run, in nature, and his studies gave him an immensely personal connection to the cosmos. Upon his return to the Leads, this feeling and connection that he had established simply could not be ignored. Quote, instead, it was interior, direct, personal, one individual alone who felt some relation with nature, with the cosmos, and it is true to say that this wordless feeling and my memories of life close to nature rather haunted me when I returned to live in Leeds. This desire to reconnect and to understand his inner self and the cosmos took him away from the life as a violent Nazi street activist and into a much more quiet and peaceful one, at least for a couple of years. A combination of tranquil blue summer skies, his desire to understand himself and the cosmos, his poetic writings, and his continuous toil of his political aims all seemed to fill this growing desire to reconnect to the other world his previous life had enshadowed. Myatt points to two specific things that would cement his way of life for the next 2 years. The first would be the listening of the music of 16th century composer Johann Sebastian Bach, and the second would be an odd encounter he had at St. Margaret's Church. Quote, not long after, I ventured to return to visit a friend in Norfolk, and somewhat early for the bus that would take me near his dwelling. I passed some time by perusing what seemed to be an interesting church, having at the time a minor interest in architecture. Somewhat tired after a long journey, I sat for a while in some pew. Then this young man in clerical garb passed in front of the altar to briefly turn toward me and smile. There was such gentleness, such purity in his face, his demeanor, and then he was gone, out of my view toward what I assumed then was some sort of door. It was as if, in that moment, I knew he might have some answers to some questions that I had been pondering for some days before, and so, instinctively, I rose to follow him, only to find a solid wall where he had disappeared from my view. And it was only later, days later, that I discovered that once, centuries ago, there had indeed been a door there, and that church itself had been part of a medieval priory. At first, he was unsure of what he had encountered, believing it to be merely a trick of the mind, a delusion, but a feeling of unease lingered. The man, according to Myatt, showed no characteristic signs of being a ghostly apparition or spirit, just a young, pleasant clerical monk with an aura of contentment and mystical peace. The questions he thought he could answer about life, what happens after death, and the story of Christ remaining unanswered still. This experience fostering continuous revelations within his mind, previously believing the answers were able to be found unaided through his own efforts, but coming to realize that this was not the case. Rather, something or someone else was out there, able to guide him towards the deeper understanding he sought so eagerly. Through Christ, he believed lied the answers to his questions, and in turn arose a beautiful, purer way of life. Myatt's original plan after his street activism was to become akin to a Taoist nomad. However, these plans would never come to pass. After some time traveling, he would happen upon a Christian monastery that had caught his interest. Quote, the door to the Abbey Church was unlocked, and I went inside. The cool quietness was slightly perfumed with incense from some recently ended mass, and a feeling of immense relief came over me, as if I had, finally, come home. Memories of a Catholic childhood flowed heavily within his mind, bringing about an immense peace and stillness he didn't believe possible. Only through some commotion of the other monks setting up their noonday prayer was he snapped out of his trance. It wouldn't be much longer after inquiring about a weekend visit that Myatt would begin his new life as a Christian monk. Myatt found himself settling into monastic life fairly well. His times in prison already accustomed him to establishing routine. St. Margaret's Church operated with a similar confine, beginning early with Abbey Chants in the daily schedule of prayer, followed by conventional mass, receiving 3 meals a day in between physical labor, study, and more scheduled prayer and spiritual contemplation. Finding his time thoroughly occupied, the outside world faded into the background, almost forgotten, save for an announcement board, but even that was sparse of outside events, rather showcasing the whereabouts of the Pope or if a religious authority, such as a bishop, was to visit the church. The monastery library radiating a medieval quietude, almost as if the modern world no longer existed. Myatt quickly developing friendships with other monks, often through discussions of religious philosophy, or questions he had regarding unknown Greek or Latin passages, of which many monks were more than equipped to answer in great detail. Things would go well for Myatt for quite some time, believing he had found his lifelong occupation, but after some months he found himself restless and wrestling with worldly longings. This feeling would be quelled somewhat with discussions among 4 other monks, one having a background in Zen Buddhism, another being a scholar in Greek, and 2 others having more religiously arcane knowledge, of which he found great interest in. Quote, the other 2 were younger monks, older than and senior in monastic terms to me, who had an interest in more arcane aspects of religion, and especially of Catholicism, and we 3 would spend hours upon hours discussing mysticism, esotericism, and religion in general, even though, according to certain monastic rules, I should not have been associating with them as much as I did. His restlessness would be quelled further by what he called numinous aspects of monastic life, such as the Latin Salve Regina, a medieval Catholic hymn to Mary, Mother of Christ, kneeling in silent prayer, and the times of short spiritual contemplation. Quote, the short contemplative time between matins and lauds, when it was peaceful, so blissfully peaceful, to wander outside in the darksome quiet, or just to sit still in the choir and sense the centuries of numinous longing, joy, and hope that had seeped forth in prayer from places such as this. However, his restlessness would continue to grow through 3 major aspects. The first was his longing for a womanly touch, and the other 2 was his combative nature and lack of humility and obedience. His nature causing many philosophical arguments, such as the meaning of logos within the Greek New Testament, and being asked to no longer discuss arcane subject matter with the 2 monks he had befriended. Although followed for a short time, the rule would quickly be broken. Myatt would continue his unmonastic attitude, posting light humor to the church's bulletin board and arguing whether or not the bell should have been rung in order to signal prayer for a fellow departed monk. It would finally come to a point where Myatt believed he no longer belonged, this opinion being shared by the church's abbot and the novice master. But this departing wouldn't be without some objection, as the friend he had made, the former Zen master monk, believed he should stay. Quote, I went to tell the monk who had been a Zen master, who said out of all the novices he had known in the past few years, I was the most monastic of all of them. This place needs people like you, he said. But he was, to be fair, something of a character himself, and had a wicked sense of humor. With that, Myatt would leave the monastic life behind and return to the Fenlands. This departure would not be entirely fruitless, however. As before his leaving, one of his tasks was to care for a terminally ill elderly monk. The abbot, seeing the quality of his care, suggested Myatt pursue a career in nursing. He would agree, and the abbot would write him a letter of recommendation, and soon Myatt would begin his life as a student nurse. A couple of significant events would occur for Myatt during this time, quarrels of love mostly, which would eventually lead him back into a life of extremism. To summarize, during his time as a working nurse, he had met a woman named Kay, another fellow nurse. She and Myatt had fallen in love and begun a relationship. But it wouldn't be too long before he met another woman whom went by the nickname Twinkle, Myatt finding himself falling in love with her in tandem. He would ignore these feelings for some time, remaining friendlier than her lover, and eventually she would move away, quelling this love Myatt felt for a bit. But a letter from Twinkle would arrive, beckoning his call, and then another, more urgent, to which Myatt would follow up. One thing led to another, and both would find their fates entwined, at least for a time. Myatt would return to his other love, Kay, and instinctively she knew what had transpired, only being proven by yet another letter from Twinkle, intended for Myatt but being intercepted by Kay, declaring her love and the possibility of bearing his child. Myatt's only feeling when confronted was unparalleled shame and dishonor. Quote, there were tears from she whom I had betrayed, and I felt ashamed, and the most wretched I had ever, up until then, felt in my life. Wretched because of her sadness, her feelings, wretched because I had so deeply hurt her, and wretched because there was no anger in her, no words or shouts of recrimination, no accusations, no flailing fists of a lover betrayed, only deep, soul-wrenching, almost utter despair. She left then to leave me alone with my dishonor, my shame. Although a bitter feeling had been left between Kay and Myatt, it would be somewhat reconciled. He had withdrawn from his nursing course and opted to move to Shropshire to marry Twinkle. A day before his departure, Kay pulled him aside, saying that if he did indeed love Twinkle, offering to aid him in a work transfer, all the while keeping an affectionate smile. Myatt, lost for words and stewing in shame, knew that Kay loved him far more than he could know, and far more than he deserved. That night before his departure, Myatt told Kay of the marriage proposal, the two spending one last night together, beginning with some wine, a loving embrace, and a final morning kiss. And with that, he would leave and never see Kay again. Myatt and Twinkle would spend 7 years of their marriage in rural South Shropshire, Myatt largely occupying his time with physical activity and his writings, including keeping in contact with Colin Jordan and John Tyndall, writing articles for his Spearhead magazine under his own name and under several pseudonyms, while his wife was more career-focused, being the main enthusiasm of her life. By contrast, gainful employment and money being more of an afterthought for Myatt, spending his weekends running, bicycling, even competing in time trials. Twinkle opting for a more socially orientated free time. On the occasions he had accepted to get together, his combative nature would show through and begin to create a rift between them. As if history was stuck repeating itself, Myatt would once again fall in love with a different woman, but this time with a twist. Twinkle too would yearn for a more passionate love with the same woman. Although the two shared this interest in this woman, Twinkle would show restraint, whereas Myatt acted upon his desire, betraying his love once more. Twinkle forgiving him for a time, but it wouldn't be long before the two would divorce and go their separate ways. Myatt once again in the bachelor's lifestyle, going on many dates and having many flings with other women that didn't go anywhere, until he came across and fell in love with yet another woman, a woman by the name of Sue. Unlike his previous relationships, his time with Sue would not end in any sort of heartbreak or betrayal, but rather more tragically, leaving a gaping hole within Myatt for quite some time to come. Meeting through a mutual acquaintance, the two quickly fell in love. Their relationship was picture perfect, both outwardly and inwardly. No fights, no affairs. Rather, a love only few get to enjoy. Sue's friend writing, "I've never seen such an instant love and attraction. I've never believed in love at first sight, but I have to admit, you and Sue seem to have been the exception that proved the rule. She had a very deep and simple love for you, which never wavered. You and Sue were privileged to have that kind of love." The two shared everything and went everywhere together. A favorite destination would be vacationing in Egypt, cruising along the Nile River. Myatt feeling a strong contentment and happiness for quite some time. Unfortunately, the happiness the two shared would only last 4 years. Sue developing cancer. After some bouts of treatment and surgery, she seemed to recover, and what I can only imagine as a way to lift up their spirits, the two took another trip to Egypt. Unfortunately, she again would be struck with horrific illness upon their return. It was believed she had contracted hepatitis or some tropical disease. Her condition would not recover, and she was given only weeks to live, the two spending as much time as they could together. Sue never wavering in her allotted time, and in turn giving Myatt the strength he needed to push forward. Quote, "Never once during those few remaining weeks of her life did she complain, even though she was on quite a high dose of morphine for her pain. Never once was she sad, dejected. Instead, it was she who, unbelievably, gave me strength and support. She was, in quite a literal way, remarkable." Her time would come to pass, and Myatt would shut himself away for many months, buried in his work of Greek translations. Although he would come to recover, and even remarry, her loss would affect him much more deeply than he wanted to admit. The vision he had of the two growing old together was replaced with another he was all too familiar with. A vision of a National Socialist empire. For Myatt, a life of simplicity spent with the woman he loved would never come to pass again. Instead, he would thrust himself back into the fray of National Socialist street politics. As with Column 88 many years earlier, he would find and associate himself with yet another organization in a similar vein, the relatively new Combat 18. Combat 18, initially a drinking group, later acting as a security force to John Tyndall's British National Party, headed by Charlie Sargent and his brother Steve Sargent, of which Myatt gave both his personal pledge of loyalty. And just a quick interesting side note, if it weren't for the efforts of a man by the name of Ray Hill, the BNP wouldn't have come about, and subsequently, the fate of Combat 18 would have likely played out very differently, if it even came about at all. Ray Hill being an informant for Searchlight magazine. According to Nigel Copsby's Contemporary British Fascism, Tyndall was struggling to keep a cohesive National Socialist movement, specifically in his National Front organization. As with many of these movements, they tend to have problems with infighting, be it organically or otherwise. This time was no different, as Tyndall was in a power struggle against the leadership of the New National Front and his former ally, Martin Webster. The man being unable to accept responsibility for election losses or political setbacks, instead pointing the blame at others. This, of course, would create bad blood and rifts in their party. Tyndall, in an effort to reunify Britain's political far right and worried that he would fall into political obscurity, created the BNP at the suggestion of Ray Hill. Quote, ironically, however, the first step toward the formation of what later became known as the British National Party was actually taken by an anti-fascist. The Searchlight spy, Ray Hill. Hill's aim was to build up the BNP and then cut it in half. Tyndall at one end and Hill at the other, further dividing the NS movement as a whole. Hill, however, would not go through with his plan. Quote, convinced that the BNP had run aground, Hill decided against contesting Tyndall's leadership. He went public instead and revealed his true colors in 1984. As said earlier, Combat 18 had its beginning as a drinking group out of the City of Paris pub, according to Steve Sargent, Charlie Sargent's younger brother, whom created and ran the organization Red Watch, which deployed much of the same expose campaigns that their counterparts like Searchlight had engaged in, among other things like stealing and reselling leftist books and conducting phone call harassment campaigns against leftist activists. Red Watch being much more organized than Combat 18 in its early life, mostly consisting of sporadic and disorganized bodyguarding, but mostly drinking, often following the lead of the BNP or Red Watch. Quote, there was no membership, no clear leader, and no plan of action. Many of its early activities were sporadic and disorganized, reflecting the nature of the men involved. You go to the pub and have a beer, says Steve Sargent. Obviously, it would be centered around something. If the BNP were doing something or the Reds were doing something, you'd pick a pub in the area and just take it from there. We never had spotters. The Reds did, but we didn't. We always lagged behind in things like intelligence. The Reds always were better at that sort of thing. More to the point, no one wanted to be out of the pub. Who wants to stand around on the street corner looking for the Reds when you could be beering it up? Hell yeah, brother, give me 1 million beers.
I think I'm buzzed.
It wouldn't be until Steve's older brother, Paul David Sargent, otherwise known as Charlie Sargent, would come into the fray and become one of the most important figures in C-18's history, notably turning it into a much more organized and militant organization, using the intelligence gathered by his brother's Red Watch in order to attack their far-left counterparts, and providing security services to many notable names and organizations within the British neo-Nazi scene at the time. Just like his compatriot, David Myatt, and many of his peers, Charlie too had a predisposition towards violence, his preferred method being knife crime, allegedly calling himself a blade merchant. His first stabbing instance would be committed against a man by the name of C. Spanner, a musician for Oi, Oi being a working-class punk rock band, even spending many stints in prison as well, namely for possession of a knife and drug running. The two brothers, although sharing the same ideology, lived in different but overlapping worlds for quite some time, Steve being more well-read and politically literate, while Charlie was far more active on the ground, making influential friends along the way, many through providing his security services. However, Steve would also broaden his horizons when it came to establishing contacts, eventually creating his Red Watch organization, complementing his older brother's newfound leadership in C-18. Of course, just like with everything spoken about so far, Combat 18 is an extensive rabbit hole on its own. I'm just going to stick with its relevance to Myatt. Similar to Column 88, Combat 18 had caught Myatt's interest because they had what he believed was necessary to bring about National Socialist change, a willingness to engage in violent street action, as he did so many years ago, coming to admire both the Sargent brothers and giving them both his personal pledge of loyalty. Although C-18 preached radical action to bring about a race war and subsequently the dismantling of the British state as it stood, Myatt took a far less active role in terms of engaging in street fights as he did back in the 70s. Rather, he took on the part of heavily molding C-18's ethos, publishing his writings in his newsletter, The National Socialist, and influencing the Sargent brothers' politics, according to Nick Lowles in his book, White Riot, The Violent Rise and Fall of Combat 18. Quote, one was David Myatt, a highly secretive figure who, while not attending public NSA activities, was to play an increasingly influential role behind the scenes, particularly on the political development of the Sargent brothers. He was also one of the few NSA supporters who really understood Nazi ideology. A little bit of context here. The NSA is shorthand for the National Socialist Alliance, a group which sought to bring all the splinter NS groups under one umbrella, with the goal of one common cause, the destruction of the system. Myatt spreading his ideals of honor, duty, and loyalty, along with more philosophical tenets like a National Socialist way of life, spirituality like esoteric Hitlerism, his spiritual significance, and much, much more. having both the ears of Steve and Charlie Sargent, and subsequently the rest of the attention of Comet 18. As Nick Ryan puts it in his 1998 article on Comet 18, the ideological heavyweight behind all this talk is a man called David Myatt. As with his past rhetoric in Column 88, the National Socialist Empire and the Aryan ideal could not come about within the system as it stood, but rather through covert subversion, decentralized action, and violent destruction with heavy risk to life and liberty in order to achieve this ideal, going as far to allegedly publish a guide in order to wage this warfare, titled A Practical Guide to the Strategy and Tactics of Revolution. Another point Myatt had emphasized both in his writings and those within Comet 18 was the idea of the Aryan homeland from which their culture could flourish, that the sacrifice for their comfortable modern lives was absolutely necessary in order for this idea to come into being. Quote, "We either make these sacrifices and find the determination to do such a thing as this in order to benefit our race, or we make excuses and act like immature, spoiled children, selfishly indulging ourselves with the comforts which the decadent materialistic society can provide. The time for talk and excuses is over. You either believe in Aryan survival or you do not." Myatt, willing to put his money where his mouth is and invest into this homeland. Quote, Myatt informed the sergeants that he was prepared to invest £30,000 toward the £200,000 he imagined was needed for the project to be a success, the rest to be raised by a combination of contributions from supportive comrades and a bank mortgage. But through disagreements on where the homeland should be, along with the British state simply not allowing it, this idea would never come to fruition. Aside from Myatt's influence, there would be 4 major events that involved him, all of which happened very close to each other, essentially marking the end of Comet 18 as it stood. The first was Charlie Sargent's arrest, his younger brother Steve Sargent and Myatt creating the National Socialist movement as a way to keep the spirit of Comet 18 alive, Myatt's 1998 conversion to Islam, and finally, the Copeland nail bombings. To understand the first, we'll touch upon a little bit of C-18 history, starting with a man by the name of Will Browning. Much like his contemporary, David Myatt, he was idealistic, a fearless fighter, and a fanatical activist, inspired by the writings of Robert Matthews, the founder of The Order, a neo-Nazi terrorist organization that had a short-lived operation during the early 80s in the US. Browning, from a young age, had violence baked into his DNA, engaging in many fights throughout his childhood, eventually being arrested for it and spending 3.5 years in juvenile hall, or a secure school as the British call it, from ages 11 to 15. Attempts being made to quell or channel these tendencies into more productive things like boxing or learning guitar. Although he did pick up these hobbies, it had been futile in quelling him. Being locked away only fueled this. Later on, he moved back to London to live with his father, where he had gotten involved with the skinhead music scene, even being a guitarist for Brutal Attack. Continuing on in his habits of violence, he and another skinhead would conduct a couple of attacks in 1989, the first being on a gay man, and later the same night towards a group of black people in a bar, both men being arrested, Browning himself spending a 3-year stint in prison. Upon his release, he would end up attending BNP meetings and rallies, and also becoming friendly with the East End Barmy Army, a passionate football club. These guys being involved in a much wider culture of British hooliganism. To give the very, very short of it, my god, in the context of Comet 18, the hooligan subculture acted as a pipeline of sorts for recruitment, Browning himself quickly earning the nickname Wilf the Beast among the hooligans, later joining Comet 18 and rising in its ranks. The most relevant part of the story being C-18's involvement in the music scene and the creation of ISD Records, which proved itself to be extremely lucrative for the group in the skinhead music scene, creating, curating, and selling their own CDs and merchandise. The company itself being controlled by Will Browning. Promises had been made to reinvest the money back into C-18 and the National Socialist Alliance, controlled by the Sargent brothers. But this simply wouldn't happen, and feuds over funds would begin, eventually creating a large rift in the group. Although attempts were made to try and patch things up, continual rumors of shit talk and later accusations of Charlie Sargent being an informant would lead to the irreparable split of Comet 18. Charlie later saying, quote, ISD Records, he told the audience, was established to provide money for C-18 and the NSA, but neither had seen a single penny. Now, Browning was trying to use threats to stay involved in the movement. He must be expelled, concluded Sargent, enthused by his reception. And Browning decrying Sargent, quote, Browning and his team systematically explained that Charlie had been expelled from C-18 for trying to divide the movement and force out the militants. The money, the Browning camp told people that night, was carefully hidden and accounted for. The movement would come to comprise the Sargent loyalists and the Browning loyalists, Myatt being on the side of the former. The shit talk would only continue and lead to Browning and some others, notably with a man by the name of Chris Castle, to hunt Sargent down. Starting with his home and then to his brother's place. Both were not found that day. Browning's rage would quickly turn into paranoia, as during his search, he would have a few encounters with police, both in uniform and likely undercover, going on a chase and encountering a strange motorist outside his door, confronting the man but receiving no convincing reply. His neighbor saying, quote, "A neighbor told Browning that there had been a lot of coming and going by unknown men in flats opposite his house, later being followed again by a car that led to a paranoid standoff, which would prove to be one-sided." Eventually, an attempt at diplomacy would be made between Browning and Sargent, Browning having stolen some plastering tools from the man's flat, wanting to return them in exchange for, quote, "blood and honor," C-18 subscription lists, and $1,000 in cash that they claimed was owed. Browning being accompanied by the aforementioned Chris Castle for this exchange. However, Browning would opt to stay in the car, as he didn't want to cause any friction. Castle entering Sargent's home, but only minutes later he would exit clutching his chest. Browning rushing to his friend's aid, believing he had the wind knocked out of him, but would soon discover that Castle had been mortally wounded, stabbed in the back. Browning would rush him to the hospital, but he would unfortunately die on arrival. At first, investigators would come upon two differing events. Sargent and his accomplice, Martin Cross, would claim self-defense, the police finding inconsistencies with Sargent's and Cross's stories, such as differing accounts of how the premises was entered, and if Browning had entered at all. While Browning, at first reluctant to speak with the police, after some persuasion from Castle's widow, along with some of his closest friends, would change his mind and recount his version of events. After another corroborating statement and forensic tests, both Martin Cross and Charlie Sargent would be arrested, charged, and convicted of murder. Steve Sargent, of course, defending his brother, this murder only solidifying the rift between the two camps of C-18, so much so that the younger Sargent brother thought that the only way to move forward was to start from scratch, giving birth to the newly formed National Socialist Movement, with David Myatt being the captain of its helm. Quote, "I was honor-bound to stay loyal to Charlie Sargent, and decided to form and lead the National Socialist Movement to continue the work he had begun." The NSM, although had membership, was more or less just a newsletter, discussing NS ideology along with his opinions on current happenings. Notably, with the Chris Castle murder, he would remain loyal to the Sargent brothers and criticize Browning for not resolving the matter in an Aryan way, that being not cooperating with state authorities, their common enemy, but rather with an honorable duel to the death between both parties. Something you'll find Myatt holds as a cornerstone in his ethos of honor, duty, and loyalty. Further stating in another autobiographic published in 1998 that returning to public prominence with the NSM was keeping his pledge to Charlie Sargent, believing he hadn't done enough to bring the Sargent and Browning camps back together and prevent what had happened. Quote, "I felt it was my duty. I believed I was responsible for what had happened to Charlie, as I believed that someone had to publicly support him. I was responsible because, in truth, I, the exponent of honor, loyalty, and duty, should have done something to prevent the situation that arose. I should have tried to bring the factions together on the basis of duty to the cause, first and foremost." Although Myatt sought unity, it was through court proceedings where he realized it was a lost cause. Not the fact that a man was murdered, but rather his big gripe at the time was the disloyalty to Charlie Sargent, via those within C-18 providing evidence against him. Myatt would retain his revolutionary attitude outwardly, but an internal struggle waged on. The lack of any real progress in the NS movement, coupled with his newfound leadership of the NSM, decrying news articles, and another arrest putting heavy strain on his marriage, he began to wonder why he even bothered at all. Quote, "For all my rhetoric, for all my revolutionary words, for all my personal effort and sacrifice, very little, if anything, of practical import had been achieved. Indeed, the situation within the exterior of the NSM and what remained of Combat 18 was analogous to the NDFM. In truth, it was far, far worse. There seemed to be little honor, even less genuine loyalty, and the usual spreading of malicious rumors and gossip. Furthermore, few people, if any, were prepared to risk their lives or their liberty for the cause that they claimed to believe in. Hard manual work on the farm was some recompense, and I seriously began to wonder why I bothered with practical politics at all." On the verge of throwing in the towel and leaving the life of National Socialism behind once more, Myatt began to think of a different strategy, another way of bringing cohesion back into the NS movement, a glue that not only people stuck to, but were willing to sacrifice their lives for. This glue being a religious aspect, or more specifically, turning National Socialism into a religion, looking towards the actions of devout Muslims for inspiration, and seeing that their belief led them to sacrifice life and liberty for their cause, a sentiment he sought so eagerly. And so he began to seriously study Islam, believing he could glean insight into what created such ferocity and apply it to National Socialism. In doing so, Myatt would find himself down another extremist path, this time of militant Islam. Not only that, but according to George Michael in his book, The Enemy of My Enemy, the alarming convergence of militant Islam and the extreme right, he would debatably do more than any other to unite the two extremes. Quote, Myatt has been among the most outspoken activists in support of fostering ties with militant Islam. Although he is little known outside Britain, he has arguably done more than any other theorist to develop a synthesis of the extreme right in Islam. Although Myatt would become a Muslim in 1998, his decision to do so was not sudden, but rather a culmination of experience and travels in and through the Muslim world, specifically Egypt. Seeing the sights of the Nile, the architecture, and the many Muslims he had spoken to about their faith, about life in general, songs of the Adhan, or calls to prayer, and the great courtesy they had showed him, coupled with seeing their devotion to said faith, had inspired him greatly. So much so that upon his return to England, he felt out of place. Quote, I returned to England to find bad manners, arrogance, materialism, decadence, and for the first time in my life, I felt somewhat out of place among my own people. But gradually, over the coming months, that feeling faded. Although at first Myatt had little interest in the teachings of Islam, his interest would gradually grow through the decade. Beginning as merely the curious travels of an outsider, along with a vacation destination with his wife Sue, and brief readings of the Quran. But as time passed, an odd feeling began to grow within him, a feeling that he had found the place where he had belonged. Quote, this was the feeling that somehow, in some strange haunting way, I belonged there, in such places, as part of such culture. Not long after Sue's death, he would begin to study Arabic, all the while continuing his travels to Egypt. Feelings of familiarity growing, continuing to experience Egypt, its people, and its culture, all leading Myatt to seriously study the tenets of Islam during the summer of '98, culminating into his conversion. Quote, in the summer of 1998, I seriously began to study Islam, to read Hadith, Sirah, and the whole Quran. I at least had some context from practical experience. Furthermore, the more I studied Islam in England in those summer months, the more I remembered the sound of the beautiful Adhan, remembered the desert, the ethereal purity, the sense of God there, and remembered the haunting feeling of perhaps already belonging to such a culture, such a way of life. Hence my conversion to Islam, then, in September of that year, seemed somehow fated, wordful. Not long after his conversion, another wave of controversy would ensue. Between April 17th and the 30th, several bombings would occur. A terrorist attack that had taken place in 3 areas of London, Soho, Spitalfields, and Brixton, perpetrated by David James Copeland. Following his trial, Myatt would be ambushed by BBC journalists and accused of inspiring the 1999 London nail bombings. The London nail bombings were a series of attacks that took place in London on April 17th, the 24th, and finally on the 30th of 1999, injuring a total of 140 people, and unfortunately claiming 4 lives, 2 of which was an expecting mother by the name of Andrea Dykes and her unborn baby boy, Copeland expressing sympathy only for them, but nothing for the other victims. His arrest coming a couple days later after the final attack on the 2nd of May. Copeland, just like Myatt, was/is a British neo-Nazi who sought to bring about an Aryan world through inspiring a race war. He believed his bombings would be the spark to light the fires of such a war. Although it's not exactly certain as to when he decided to become a National Socialist, in his late teens and early 20s, he found himself a part of the BNP, attending both their rallies, such as this one where he can be seen with the party's leader, John Tyndall, and their meetings becoming essentially a security guard. It wouldn't be long before he saw the BNP as simply not enough and turned to much more radical groups. A sign of this was the police finding a copy of the Turner Diaries among his belongings, itself a work of dystopian fiction that would lead to a white nationalist future. The book believed to have inspired the actions of the Order and Alan Berg's assassination, among some others. Not long after his membership with the BNP, he would join the National Socialist movement, his membership being approved by Steve Sargent and its newest leader at the time, a man by the name of Tony Williams, writing his acceptance letter and later appointing him as leader of his regional chapter in Hampshire. His first target being what he thought was a predominantly black area, Brixton. However, he came to find out that the people there were far more varied in their skin color. At first, someone claiming to be part of Combat 18 would claim responsibility for this attack. The authorities were cautious of this call, unsure if it was a group effort or the work of a lone wolf. His second attack would come on the 24th at Brick Lane Market in Spitalfields. Expecting a busy street market, he would only be met with closed businesses. His final attack would come merely days after his last, in Soho at the Admiral Duncan, targeting gay people. Feeling he was close to being caught, seeing his face in newspapers and hearing his description announced on the radio, he rushed his last attack. He would subsequently be arrested on May 2nd and later sentenced to life in prison. After the events, many were trying to understand what had influenced him. Although he seemed very forward with his inspirations, the journalists looking into the story were still trying to glean insight into what else may have led him to these attacks, going as far to ambush and question the leading figures of the NSM. First, Steve Sargent.
Mr. Sargent, we want to talk to you. Can we talk to you? We're from Panorama. We'd like to talk about David Copeland and the National Socialist Movement.
Second, Tony Williams.
Mr. Williams, we're from Panorama. We'd like to speak to you about David Copeland and the National Socialist Movement. Can you please come to the door?
And finally, the main man himself.
Mr. Myatt, we're from the BBC, we're from Panorama. We wanted to ask you some questions about the NSM and David Copeland, the London nail bomber.
I have no comment to make.
You called for the creation of racial tension, and that's exactly what Copeland did. You inspired Copeland indirectly to do what he did.
No comment about anything to do with that.
But 2 years ago, when you were head of the NSM was calling for the creation of racial terror with bombs.
I have no comment to make about the past, as I said, and as...
Well, the fact that you're making no comment, doesn't that make it clear that you are accepting some responsibility?
I have no comment to make about responsibility and anything to do with that.
Any guilt?
What I feel is between me and God. It's nothing to be made public. It is a private matter.
The indirect inspiration the BBC host is referring to is this text, a practical guide to strategy and tactics of revolution. It's specifying tactics of war, such as legally gaining political power, organized resistance, and lone wolf activism. One of the points of direct action being terroristic bombings. Although it's believed he did write this work, Myatt himself has cited sources claiming that there is no evidence supporting this allegation. However, the writing itself has an emphasis on certain tenets that Myatt is very fond of, such as honor, loyalty, and duty, and the warrior archetype, values that had gotten him into the ideology in the first place. An example would be the criteria for war. Whatever tactics used, they should remain honorable. Quote, "What is important is for us to fight. It does not matter what tactics we use provided that they are both practical and honorable. That is, the only real restriction on our choice of tactics should be that they are, or could be, effective against the enemy, and that they are honorable." And just as a quick side note, honor itself being spelled with an O-U-R, the preferred English spelling. So at the very least, this document is likely British in origin. As far as it's known, Copeland and Myatt never formally interacted. If Myatt were simply a run-of-the-mill reformed extremist, he wouldn't be a part of this story. Now that we know of his early to midlife, and before we delve into what he may or may not have been doing in the last 25-odd years, let's get into the allegations of another history. A history that has firmly sewn itself to the man, his legacy, and beyond. A history that he is essentially known for and has vehemently denied and likely will continue to deny until he lies squarely in his grave. A history that many of his critics and admirers alike believe is the truth. That everything Myatt has done in his life, even to this day, is an insight role. A role which I can only presume has stuck with his prior goals of sowing chaos and bringing about a new aeon in the causal world. And ultimately, for Myatt himself, to ascend past the abyss and into the acausal plane after his death. But we'll save that for the next and final installment. So stick around, because it's all so very
interesting.